Okay, so you want to own a landfill. It sounds like the ultimate boring but brilliant business. People will always make trash. You collect a fee for every truckload that rolls onto your property, you bury it, and the checks never stop. Because nobody has ever solved the problem of garbage by simply deciding to stop producing it. It feels almost recession-proof. Bad economy, good economy, people still throw things away. Here's the problem with that picture. You are thinking about a landfill the way you'd think about a parking lot. Buy the land, put up a fence, collect money while trucks come and go. A landfill isn't that. A landfill is closer to a long-term chemical containment facility that happens to also be a business. And the trash you're getting paid to accept today is a liability you are legally required to keep managing for decades after you've stopped accepting a single bag of it. Understanding that difference is the whole story, and it explains both why this became one of the most quietly dominant industries in American infrastructure, and why the worst-case version of this business can turn into a multi-generational, nine-figure nightmare sitting under a neighborhood. Start with what it costs to build the thing, because this is where the naive version of the business collapses almost immediately. You cannot simply dig a hole and start throwing garbage in it. Since federal regulations tightened in the 1990s, a modern municipal solid waste landfill has to be engineered like a bathtub designed to never leak for the rest of human history. Industry cost analyses put total construction costs for a modern lined landfill cell somewhere between $300,000 and $800,000 per acre, and real-world examples confirm just how wide that range runs. One landfill authority in Pennsylvania documented building a lined cell for $246,000 per acre in 2001. And by 2023, a newer cell on the same property cost roughly $1 million per acre to construct. That's not inflation alone. That's the regulatory bar rising underneath the entire industry, year after year, cell after cell. What actually eats that budget is the liner system, and it's worth understanding what you're paying for because it explains almost every other decision in this business. Beneath every modern landfill sits a stack of engineered layers: compacted clay, a synthetic plastic membrane usually made of high-density polyethylene, a drainage layer, and a network of perforated pipes designed to collect leachate, the liquid that seeps down through decomposing garbage and would otherwise carry contaminants straight into the groundwater below. That liner system alone can represent 15 to 25% of a landfill's entire development budget, and once it's in the ground, it is essentially never removed, checked, or replaced during the landfill's operating life. If it develops a flaw, you don't get to dig it back up and fix it. You live with the consequences for the life of the site. So before a single truck has paid a single dollar to dump anything, a 100-acre landfill can already represent tens of millions of dollars in site work, engineering, and liner construction, plus the cost of the land itself, plus the multi-year permitting process required to get local and state approval for a facility that every single neighboring resident will actively oppose. This is the first hidden truth of the business. The hardest, most expensive part of a landfill isn't operating it. It's convincing regulators and a community that you should be allowed to build it at all, and then engineering it well enough that it never leaks for 100 years. Now assume you've cleared that hurdle and the trucks start arriving. This is where the revenue model finally shows up, and it runs on something called a tipping fee, the price charged per ton of waste dropped off at the gate. According to the Environmental Research and Education Foundation, which surveys hundreds of landfills nationally every year, the national average municipal solid waste tipping fee reached $62.28 per ton in 2024, up about 10% from the year before, the largest single-year jump since 2022. But that national average is hiding an enormous regional spread that tells you almost everything about how this business actually works. Kansas landfills charged as little as $34.78 a ton because the state has abundant remaining landfill capacity. Alaska charged $124.25 a ton, nearly double the national number, because remote locations and difficult terrain make every part of running a landfill more expensive out there. The Northeast averaged over $80 a ton, the highest region in the country, largely because dense population centers there have less available land and stricter regulations limiting new capacity. That regional gap is the entire business model in miniature. A landfill's pricing power isn't set by how much it costs to bury a ton of trash. It's set by how much capacity exists nearby and how badly the surrounding area needs somewhere to put its garbage. A landfill sitting in a region with plenty of open capacity behaves like a commodity business, fighting for volume on thin margins. A landfill sitting in a dense region running low on permitted space behaves like a monopoly, because building a brand new competing site nearby, given the permitting fight involved, can take years and may simply never happen at all. This is why some of the country's most profitable landfills aren't the biggest ones. They're the ones sitting in exactly the wrong place for anyone else to build a competitor. Here's the detail that surprises people once they understand tipping fees. A large share of what you pay at the gate isn't actually going toward digging the hole you're using today. One waste industry publication points out that national haulers frequently own the landfills their own trucks deliver to, and the fee showing up on your invoice is often marked up well above the landfill's own posted gate rate, with the markup buried in contract fine print that most commercial customers never scrutinize closely. The visible transaction, a truck backing up and dumping a load, is not really the product being sold. The product is exclusive control over one of the few remaining places in the region legally allowed to accept waste at all, and that scarcity is what the fee is actually pricing. But even that pricing power runs into the second half of the equation, the part that makes landfills fundamentally different from almost every other real estate business. The bill doesn't stop when the landfill stops accepting trash. Under federal regulations, once a landfill closes, the owner is required to install a final cap over the entire site at a cost estimated between $200,000 and $326,000 per acre, and then continue monitoring groundwater, managing leachate, and maintaining that cap for a mandatory post-closure care period of 30 years. On a 100-acre site, that post-closure obligation alone can run somewhere between $6 million and $9 million, and it produces exactly zero revenue the entire time. The landfill's active life might run 20 to 30 years. Its legal liability runs for at least 30 years beyond that. You are, in effect, signing up for a 60-year financial commitment on a property that only generates income for roughly half of it. This is why regulators don't simply take a landfill operator's word that they'll be good for those future costs. Federal rules require owners to demonstrate financial assurance, essentially proving in advance, through a trust fund, bond, insurance policy, or corporate financial test, that the money to pay for closure and 30 years of post-closure care will actually be there when the time comes, regardless of what happens to the company in the meantime. That requirement exists because landfill operators have, historically, gone bankrupt, gotten acquired, or simply walked away, leaving state governments and taxpayers holding a liability nobody budgeted for. The genuinely counterintuitive part of this industry is what happens to the trash after you've been paid to bury it. A layperson assumes garbage just sits there, inert, doing nothing. It doesn't. As organic material decomposes without oxygen deep inside a landfill, it produces landfill gas, roughly half of which is methane, a potent greenhouse gas. For decades, that gas was treated purely as a hazard to be vented off and burned safely. Then the major waste companies realized it was also a second revenue stream sitting on top of the first one. Waste Management's own securities filings disclose 103 landfill gas beneficial use projects as of the end of 2025, converting methane into renewable natural gas, electricity, and tradable environmental credits, sold under 20-year power purchase agreements to utilities. Republic Services runs a comparable program, with one facility alone in Nevada capturing an estimated 60 to 90% of the methane a landfill produces and turning it into enough electricity to power thousands of homes under a 2-decade contract with the local utility. What makes this second income stream so structurally interesting is that it doesn't require new land, new permits for a new dump, or a single additional truckload of trash. It's revenue extracted from decomposition that was already happening anyway, on ground you already own and are already required to monitor. The apparent liability, decades of decomposing waste that has to be watched and managed, quietly becomes an ongoing energy asset. That's the kind of reversal that only becomes visible once you look past the simple picture of a landfill as a static hole in the ground. None of this changes the fact that the entire business rests on a single assumption, that the engineered barrier between the waste and the surrounding environment holds for decades without failure. And when that assumption breaks, the consequences don't stay contained to a balance sheet. They become a regional crisis that plays out over years, in public, in a way that no amount of gas-to-energy revenue can offset. The clearest example of what happens when a landfill goes wrong sits just outside St. Louis, Missouri, at a place called West Lake Landfill, next to a companion site called Bridgeton Landfill. West Lake began as an ordinary limestone quarry turned landfill in the 1950s and 60s. In 1973, contractors illegally dumped waste left over from the Manhattan Project, the wartime program that produced the first atomic bombs, mixing radioactive uranium processing residue directly into the landfill material instead of disposing of it properly. For years, nobody outside a small circle of regulators knew that was sitting there. The site was added to the federal Superfund list of the nation's most contaminated locations in 1990, which is already a sign that something has gone seriously wrong. But the real crisis arrived 2 decades later. Starting in 2010, the adjacent Bridgeton landfill developed what regulators call a subsurface smoldering event, an underground chemical reaction that generates heat and slowly consumes buried waste like a fire, but without enough oxygen to burn cleanly or extinguish naturally. It has continued, essentially uninterrupted, for more than 14 years, producing noxious odors that reach surrounding neighborhoods and raising a specific, terrifying question that regulators had to take seriously. What happens if that underground heat reaches the radioactive material sitting just a few hundred feet away? The financial consequences of that uncertainty escalated in stages that mirror exactly the kind of cost spiral this industry is built to avoid. The EPA's original 2008 proposal was simply to cap the radioactive material in place and leave it buried, estimated at around $75 million. Public and political pressure rejected that as insufficient. By 2018, the agency settled on a partial excavation plan costing roughly $236 million. Then, in January of 2025, after new testing revealed the contamination was significantly more widespread than previously understood, the EPA expanded the cleanup by another 40 acres, requiring the removal of 20,000 additional cubic yards of contaminated soil and debris, pushing the total cost toward $400 million. A full excavation of everything, if regulators ever require it, has been estimated at nearly $700 million and would take an estimated 15 years to complete. Compare that to the same site's estimated $75 million cap-in-place cost from 2008, and you can see the entire arc of this industry's worst-case risk in one set of numbers. A decision that looked survivable at $75 million ballooned toward $700 million once the true scope of the underlying problem became clear, because underground contamination doesn't stay the size regulators originally estimated it to be. That cost isn't landing on one party either. It's being split across the Department of Energy, a corporate successor tied to the original waste generator, and Republic Services, the current owner of the landfill, a company that in a separate 2018 settlement paid $16 million related to the Bridgeton situation specifically. This is the domino effect at the center of the whole industry. One buried mistake from 1973, invisible for nearly 2 decades, triggered a Superfund designation, which triggered an underground fire nobody could put out, which triggered an escalating cleanup cost that nearly decoupled from its original estimate, which is now being litigated and negotiated among multiple corporate and government parties more than 50 years after the waste was first dumped. The site's owner today is paying for a decision made by people who worked there in the Nixon administration. West Lake is the extreme version, involving a genuinely unusual radioactive contamination event that most ordinary municipal landfills will never encounter. But the underlying mechanism it demonstrates, that landfill liability compounds and escalates the longer a problem goes undetected, is exactly why the industry's financial assurance and 30-year post-closure monitoring requirements exist in the first place. Regulators built a system assuming that some fraction of landfills will eventually surprise their owners, and required money to be set aside in advance, specifically because waiting until the surprise arrives to figure out how to pay for it has historically gone badly. The industry has adapted to this reality less by avoiding risk entirely and more by consolidating it into the hands of companies large enough to absorb it. Ownership of American landfills has concentrated heavily into a small number of major waste companies, the same firms that operate the collection trucks, the recycling facilities, and, increasingly, the gas-to-energy plants sitting on their own closed sites. That consolidation exists partly because scale genuinely helps. A company managing hundreds of landfills can spread the engineering expertise, the regulatory relationships, and the balance sheet capacity to satisfy financial assurance requirements across its entire portfolio, in a way an individual, small-scale landfill owner simply cannot. It's the same logic that pushed cell towers and other capital-intensive, contract-driven industries toward large, professionally managed operators rather than individual owners. When the downside risk is measured in decades and potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, only an entity with a correspondingly large and diversified balance sheet can credibly promise to still be solvent when the bill eventually comes due. So does owning a landfill actually work as a business? The honest answer depends enormously on which landfill, in which region, permitted under which set of engineering standards, monitored under which oversight regime. In the optimistic scenario, you operate a well-engineered, well-sited landfill in a region with limited remaining capacity, commanding tipping fees at or above the regional average, supplemented by a mature gas-to-energy program generating steady contracted revenue for 2 decades on infrastructure you were already required to build. Under those conditions, the fixed cost of the liner and the permitting fight becomes an asset that keeps paying you long after most of the trucks that filled the original hole have stopped coming. Because scarcity of legal disposal capacity, not the cost of digging dirt, is what sets your price. In the realistic negative scenario, something in that engineered barrier fails, or a legacy contamination problem that predates your ownership surfaces years or decades into operation, and the post-closure financial assurance you were required to set aside turns out to be a fraction of what an escalating, multi-decade cleanup actually costs. The gap between those two outcomes isn't measured in a bad quarter. It's measured in the difference between a facility that quietly generates cash for 60 years and one that generates headlines, lawsuits, and a 9-figure liability for just as long. A landfill looks, from the road, like the simplest business imaginable, a fenced hole that trucks pay to fill. It isn't. It's a heavily engineered containment system wearing the appearance of empty land, built on the promise that a liner installed once will hold for a century, priced according to how scarce legal disposal space is in the surrounding region rather than what it costs to dig, and legally obligated to keep being managed for decades after the last truck has already left. The trash isn't really the product. The scarcity of somewhere else to legally put it is. And the fee you pay at the gate today is a down payment on a liability that doesn't finish being paid off until long after most of the people who signed the original permits are gone.